So I want to start by talking about the perils of letting someone else decide first. And of course, the first thing that popped into my mind is the scene from The Princess Bride, where Vizzini and the masked man decide on which of the wine goblets, and he goes through his whole thing. I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me, back and forth and on. And then, of course, ultimately switches them and thinks that he's won, which he has not. Two other things came to my mind. One was the parental genius, if you have two or more kids, of saying, you cut the cake or whatever it is, but your sibling gets to pick first. In which case you will see that child making sure they are the equal size. Clara has a book, and I was looking for this picture and didn't find it online. Clara has a book from the Sweet Pickle series. Some of you might have read those to your kids a long time ago. My sister read them when she was a kid, and Nicole liked them and found them for Clara, where they do that, and the alligator gets out a ruler and measures the piece of cake to figure out which one is the biggest so he can take the bigger one. I couldn't find a picture of that, so I got these other two boys with their cake. And then lastly, of course, is the dilemma for any dating or married couple. What movie should we see? We're going on date night, we're going to go see a movie, but who gets to pick? And that can be, dangerous. Because you could, in graciousness, say, no, you pick, dear, and end up with that movie that was the last one you wanted to see, hoping that they were going to pick the one you wanted to see, yada, yada. And it works the same with who gets to control the remote at home or who gets to set the radio station in the car. Some of you are familiar with these kinds of things if you have different tastes than your spouse. It's a risk when you say, no, you decide. You can pick. Let's take a look at chapter 13 of Genesis. It says, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. As we saw last week, the second half of chapter 12 was chronicling an episode where Abram had failed to live by faith while sojourning in Egypt. Now, here in chapter 13, as the narrative shifts back to Canaan, the question before us will be, how will Abram respond the next time that life's circumstances call upon him to trust in God's promises? As it turns out, it's going to be right here in chapter 13. The very next thing will answer that question. Has he been chastened by his failure? Has he learned from his mistake? Abram's nephew and foster son, Lot, wasn't mentioned in chapter 12, but he evidently went with Abram and Sarai to Egypt, which is no surprise because he's part of Abram's household. Remember, this is a culture in the ancient Near East that gives great deference to the oldest male in the family line. So, of course, they all went together. The text also notes that Abram's assets have grown considerably since he journeyed to Canaan at God's direction. Now, we'd all prefer to have more assets rather than less, right? We like it when the numbers are going up, not down. But believe me, I have no idea where this reference came from. As I was sitting, this popped into my mind, and I said, it's perfect for this moment, but it's not one of my normal ones. This is not Lord of the Rings. This is not Star Wars. It's a little bit different. Bear with me. As the rapper Notorious B.I.G. sang in a song that was released just before his death, and see, now you're laughing and you're saying, he doesn't normally quote gangsta rappers. That's not my thing, but I've heard this phrase and it's perfect. As he sang, mo money, mo problems. And I know you're all familiar with that song from the 90s, but still, having more things is exactly what causes the incident that we're going to be reading about here. It says, from the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. So Abram retraces his steps by returning to the locales from the first half of chapter 12. It has probably been a few years. We don't know how much time transpired because it's just a continuous narrative. A few years at least, probably, since he was last here in Bethel. It appears that the altar that he built here remains intact, or at least was repaired by him. He is able to use it once more in conjunction with worship of the Lord. Question: did Abram not call on the name of the Lord while in Egypt? This is one of those things that we sometimes do this with Scripture, and you got to be careful to assume from silence something. I'm going to suppose about it, but the text didn't say anything about whether he called on the name of the Lord while he was in Egypt. If he didn't, it would partially explain his lack of faith while he was there. And it would be consistent with the common belief in the ancient Near East that your God is localized. He's connected to a mountain or a river or a valley or something, and not universal. If Abram was operating under that false belief, it raises more questions about that last chapter. Whether or not that idea played a role in Egypt, we know that Abram sought the Lord there and then when he returned to Bethel. We're told now Lot was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. Canaan, about 4,000 years ago, was a much more fertile land than it is today. It had a lot more trees and considerably more wildlife. We know that there were lions and bears in these hills back then. But it was still a semi-arid hill country, and Abram and Lot were grazing large flocks in it. So their increasing combined herds were too large to be supported by the available water and grass. Now, we're more familiar with problems associated by decline and failure, school closures and populations and all of that stuff. We deal with that a lot in life. But increases and success can also pose a challenge if you don't handle them well. We're told that quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. The employees of Abram and Lot were not able to work very well together. Conflict of some kind or other was probably inevitable given the constraints of the land. These are the kinds of resource management disputes that history is filled with. You might not realize it, but the infamous exploits of Billy the Kid were connected to a local range war that was going on between competing factions over who got to use the land for what purpose. The text also reminds us that Abram and Lot had limited space to begin with because they're sharing this land with multiple tribes, not families, tribes that would have probably demanded the best land for themselves. Abram and Lot were probably using what was left over. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we're close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." As is his right, Abram, as the leader of their clan, their family, sets the terms for how this disruption between his own interests and those of his nephew Lot will be resolved. He has every right to say, this is how we're going to make this decision. Note that Abram states his goal for this before he tells Lot what the decision is. Family harmony was, to Abram, a higher priority than how this land would be used. This is, of course, a noble sentiment. but it's one that many families struggle to remember when business is at hand between them, or money is at stake, or self-proclaimed rights are being disputed. We all know about this. Some of us have been through this with our own families. Some of us have been through this personally, where it is difficult to set aside business or money or rights within your family for the sake of harmony. If Abram's decision is worthy of these high ideals that he has stated, it will be a step in the right direction after how he did in Egypt. So what did he decide to do? Let Lot pick first. This is, to say the least, a shockingly gracious decision. Now, this would be generous in any culture, even more so in one where age is elevated above youth. We have the opposite thing in our culture, right? We worship youth. But in their culture, it was all about being the elder. It had tremendous respect and rights associated with it. And Abram sets all of that aside. In addition, God had chosen Abram, not Lot. So Abram could have said, you know, Lot, I'm the chosen one. You need to take a hike. Instead, Abram behaves in a way nearly the opposite of what he did in Egypt. In Egypt, Abram chose deception out of fear. It was a failure to trust God's promises to him, which of course would never have been fulfilled if he'd been murdered in Egypt. So obviously his promises had to keep Abram alive. But here, however, Abram acts as if he believed that Lot's choice cannot possibly upset God's plan. Now, there's probably some of this that is connected to his love of Lot, and that probably factored into his calculations. After all, Lot has been his foster son since Abram's brother died years and years ago, and Abram to this point has no children of his own. Even if Abram's decision was 50-50, part of it was I love Lot and I want the best for him, and part of it was I trust God no matter what. Faith is still a part of why he's doing this. Which means that like Peter, after his denial, Abram wasn't washed up or discarded by God because he failed once. He had a second chance to prove that he trusted God in the day-to-day decisions of his life. And this time, he passed the test with flying colors. This serves as a reminder of an important lesson. Theology is straightforward. It's an endeavor of truths and logic and ethics. But people now are complicated. People don't always act in ways consistent with their stated beliefs. And people can change for better or for worse as they journey through life. Abraham believed God this whole time, but while he was in Egypt, he failed to live up to it. Here back in Canaan, he does live up to it. People can be complicated. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Before we continue, I'll just remind you what these pictures are. These are ones that I took from the top of the Tel, the hill at Bet Shean. This is about a third of the way down the Jordan River Valley from the Sea of Galilee towards the Dead Sea. If you look on the picture of the left, you can see the water and the top. That is the Jordan River. The mountains of the country of Jordan are on the other side in the distance. So that's the Jordan River Valley out there in the distance. The picture on the right is the hill country leading back up into Judea. And that actually is the valley that ends at Megiddo in that direction. So the hill country on one side, the Jordan River Valley on the other. That's what they are going to be deciding between. So Abram's offer to Lot of the first choice is very generous. That much seems clear. But what were the choices? Is there really much difference between this way and that? From the hill country of Judea, the Jordan River Valley is easy to spot. It isn't all that wide, on average only 6 miles across. So you can see the hills of modern-day Jordan rising up on the other side of the river, right there. What makes this valley stand out is its relative lushness as it draws water from the Sea of Galilee and from the many streams, both on the east and the west, that flow into this valley. To Lot, this river valley seemed like paradise, a much more hospitable place to live than the arid hills that form the spine of this region. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Lot could have taken the lesser choice and let his elder Abram take the seemingly better one. He probably should have, in keeping with cultural expectations and with the kind of common decency we expect when someone says, "No, you decide." You ought to take their thoughts into it, right? If someone says, "You pick," you should do that. Now, you also should not do the double thinking it, right? Reverse psychology. I'll let my wife pick, and then she'll feel guilty and pick the one I want, and then I'll still be the hero. Don't do that, people, all right? But Lot didn't do that. We don't know enough about Lot. In the book of Genesis, we really don't know enough about him to dissect this choice. In the book of Genesis, we get bits and pieces about Lot and his character, but I think he's an enigma. He's definitely not a hero, but I don't think he's a villain either. He's something in between, a regular guy. He took the good one. Abram gave him the choice, and he said, "Hey, thanks, I'll take it." Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plains and pitched his tents near Sodom. True to his word, Abram avoided conflict with Lot by going west up into the hills to the familiar places he had already wandered through since arriving in Canaan. Lot, on the other hand, does what's a bit unusual for someone who is a nomadic herder. He pitches his tent next to a walled town in the plain, in this case next to Sodom, an area inhabited normally by farmers. Now, there was tension typically between those using the land for farming and those wanting to use the land for pastoral herding. That's natural in history. In this case, that didn't deter Lot from dwelling near one of these early urban centers. Now, we certainly know that God appreciates shepherds. There's an awful lot of shepherd stuff in the Word of God. Jesus extends that to fishermen. God likes them too. But God isn't anti-city at the same time. His evident love in the years to come for Jerusalem will remind us of that fact. The people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The issue at hand isn't urban versus rural. It's that this particular city has drawn the ire of the Lord. Here, verse 13 serves as foreshadowing to the story in chapters 18 to 19 of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We'll dig into the issues of the people at that point, so don't worry about that now. We'll get to it. Here, our focus is on Lot, which begs the question that will be relevant when we get to chapter 18. Did Lot know, when he made this choice, about God's displeasure with what was happening in and around Sodom? Did he know anything about these people at that point? Was he ignorant of their behavior, or was he ignorant of God's moral standards? For now, the text leaves Lot in a precarious situation and returns to Abram. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west." The second half of this episode between Abram and Lot amounts to God validating Abram's generosity to his nephew by reassuring him that neither his nor Lot's decision in this matter will change anything in the long run. God starts that process by having Abram take a look around at the land of Canaan in all four directions. All the land that you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. It isn't about Abram or Lot choosing it all, nor about the Canaanites who already live here. What really matters is God's promise to give the land, all of it, including the part that Lot has chosen for himself, to Abram's, as of yet still hypothetical, offspring. So God says, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Speaking of which, there won't be any need for Abram to care about future generations inheriting this land if he doesn't get any children in the first place. Remember, Abram is living here year after year, trusting in God's promises, neither of which is going to be fulfilled quickly. They're not going to inhabit this whole land anytime soon, and he's not going to have offspring as numerous as the stars or the dust anytime soon. However, if God does indeed bless Abram and build his descendants into such a vast host, it would then make a whole lot of sense that the entirety of this promised land of Canaan would be given to them. And of course, that was the situation when Moses is writing these things. They were a great host by the time they left Egypt. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. God knows that Abram will only live long enough to see the very first steps of the journey that this promise will create. For Abram, this was always going to be more of an idea than a reality. That's just the nature of a promise about the distant future. He can only see the very first steps of it. So God sends Abram on a walking tour of the land that will one day be called Israel. On that tour, he will encounter 7 tribes, impressive walled cities, and other various obstacles standing in the way of that vision of the future. None of them will matter when the day comes. The practical considerations will take a back seat at that point to divine will in action. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Abram ends this episode like a man living by faith, a man communing with the Lord and at rest in his promises. This is the Abram that we will call the hero of the faith. He's also the same man that failed to trust God in Egypt not long before this. The reason why is what we already know. Abram was a good man, a man God declared to be righteous because of his faith. But he was also a flawed man, no different than we are. It's wonderful to avoid mistakes in life, right? To exercise wisdom in the way that helps us avoid pitfalls, things of guilt and regret. It is very good to avoid them in the first place. And that's what Abram did here by being generous. But it's just as important to learn from the mistakes that we make, to avoid repeating them, and to, by the grace of God, grow stronger on the other side of them. And that's a lesson our father in the faith, Abraham, knew full well. 4 things of application for you to remember from this text. Number 1, family squabbles can be confronted with pride or grace. Abram chose wisely by showing kindness to Lot. Something for us to remember when we face difficulties in our own families. Number 2, Abram's graciousness was an act of faith, a return to trusting in God once more. God rewarded Abram's faith by restating his promises, a reminder to us that the next step after faith is continued faith. And then lastly, Abram learned from his mistakes in Egypt by choosing wisdom and faith the next time. Like him, we too can utilize God's grace to learn from our mistakes.